Hi, it's Stu Richards from Bredin. Thank you for joining us on our webcast today. As people log in, what I wanted to do was to give you a quick overview, for those of you who might not be familiar with Bredin, with what we're all about and how we help companies to better understand and engage the small to mid-sized business segment, and why research is near and dear to our hearts. So by way of introduction, Bredin is a B2B consultancy specializing in helping clients to better understand and engage with small to mid-sized businesses, however they define SMB. We tend to think of SMB more or less the way the Small Business Administration defines it. So our default is we think of under 20 employees as very small businesses, 20 to 99 employees as small business, and 100 to 500 is mid-size. But of course, every one of our clients, and you can see the folks with whom we've worked over the years, has a different definition of or sweet spot in the SMB space, whether they define them by headcount or revenue or industry or stage of growth or you name it. But regardless of exactly who they're focused on, our objective is to help them to develop long-term profitable relationships with SMBs. And we do that in two ways. One is to conduct research, of course, which is why this topic is so near and dear to our hearts today. And the other is to help our clients to engage SMBs with content. So a word on our research, what we do is survey SMBs, and you can see on the left, we can kind of slice and dice respondents in a variety of ways, whether it's by role or their area responsibility within the organization, their level, their location can be pretty much anywhere, by industry, by size, of course, or by other criteria. So, our clients might be interested in serving their own customers or competitors' customers or, users of particular products. And we do research. We certainly don't introduce ourselves as consumer researchers, but we've done a fair amount of consumer research, mostly for folks who are interested in understanding, for example, how do consumers plan to, for example, shop small or, buy at small businesses. In terms of the kinds of things we research for clients in the topics area, you can see a wide range of different kinds of topics that we've deep dived on for our clients. And methodologically, we're pretty agnostic. We do qualitative and quantitative. In the quantitative realm, we do, in addition to providing full service custom research, we do a monthly pulse survey of 500 principals of US small businesses. And that is really designed to make it quick and easy for clients to generate data from the small business market, whether it's for landscape assessment, before a bigger research initiative, or, many of our clients use it for generating data for outbound programs. Analytically, we offer a wide array of different kinds of analytics, again, depending on what research objectives are. But at the end of the day, the research we do is either designed to provide insight for decision making, for example, around product, around go-to-market strategy, around the customer experience, or it's designed to support outbound programs. So using data that we've generated via research to support content or PR or social or what have you. The other thing that we do, and actually the way we got our start, is to develop content programs. We kind of backed into research, initially because the research, the user experience wasn't that great on some of our client sites long ago. So we started out with user experience research and have since broadened into full service. But whether we develop content that is based on research that we do or research that our clients already have, or it might be completely research independent. For example, it might be very advisory content. The objective is to make sure that our clients are presented as the hero or trusted advisor, and we develop content that can be used across the entire sales cycle, again, to help our clients to achieve their awareness, engagement, conversion, and ultimately revenue objectives. So that's it. What I wanted to dive in today is a couple things. Research applications, which I doubt is going to come as news to most of you on this call, but it's always great to talk about or get a refresher on what research can do for you. The common research mistakes that we see and really try to help our clients steer clear of, especially in the SMB space. And then finally, some questions to ask your research vendor, and the first thing that we wanted to jump into, in terms of why is it that research is so important? It's just because obviously it allows you to do a better job, to have more confidence in decision making around, again, whether it is what's the optimal set of features in your product, what's the optimal pricing, who are the folks to whom you should be selling it, and how do you reach them? Or what's their user experience like? How do we make it stickier? How do we improve retention, usability, integrations, you name it. It can obviously answer so many questions for you around, product marketing and consumer experience strategy or customer experience strategy. And of course, it can help with direct, kind of revenue generating marketing programs like content, like social, like PR. And it can be very useful actually supporting sales material development for a direct or indirect sales team or to support events. So, it can obviously play a lot of roles and, it can get fairly high budgets depending on, different organizations' kind of belief in the role of research. But it obviously has to be done well because, the fundamental rule of research is garbage in, garbage out. So what we really want to do to help you avoid that is to take a look at, some of the ways that can go awry in the development and execution of research. So starting at the beginning, one of the things that is really critical to research is just understanding, before a project is kicked off, why is it that we're doing this research? And that can be surprisingly unclear. For example, there might be an organization that has multiple groups within it. So sales and marketing and brand and product and, you name it, might all want to go to market to answer different questions. And they might want to choose to, combine all the questions in one vehicle. Or, it might not be clear, for example, what exactly we want to do in terms of, who we're going to be asking our survey of. So fundamentally, and this should go without saying, but it does happen, really, really important to be clear on what is it exactly we want to use this research for. So, for example, are we going to be using it for product development? Are we going to be using it for marketing decisions? Understanding what kinds of decisions is it going to inform? Because if you don't have a clear objective of that, then obviously you can select the wrong research format, the wrong participants, come up with all kinds of errors in the survey instrument, which we'll talk through, but ultimately become unable to find actionable results or generate erroneous results. So of course, really important upfront, outlining specific objectives. How are the results going to be used? What decisions is it going to inform? What are the priority research topics in case you need to whittle them back, which is often the case. It can be very easy to just dump more and more and more questions into a survey project, but really important to understand, what's the fundamental objective and what are the priority questions we want to have answered. And then that, of course, should drive the analytic methodology as well. So just a primer, and again, this may not be news to many or most of you on the call, but fundamentally, of course, and this is leaving out, of course, ideation sessions, ethnographic, product testing, beta testing, all that kind of stuff. And of course, qual and quant are not mutually exclusive. Many of the projects we do start with qual and are followed by quantitative, or might be quantitative, but they might have a qual component for a subset of respondents, for example. So, clearly very complementary, but, each individually has fairly different formats and objectives. So, for qualitative, where you're talking about, of course, talking to a few people, that might be one-on-one, dyad, triad, focus groups of, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, or of course, might be working sessions where you're actually doing, some sort of brainstorming. But typically they're more focused on getting, audience reactions to concepts or responses to questions. Best, of course, at the qualitative level when you're doing exploratory research to get a sense of, what is it you're looking for? What are your problems on a day-to-day basis? What kind of solutions would help you with your business pain points? And getting at emotions. What are the drivers of different purchase decisions or different behaviors, and understanding how do those emotions drive potential purchasing behavior or usage of channels, or to what degree, for example, they may need to lean on your advisory content or your sales team or what have you. The caveat with qual, of course, is it's very easy and very tempting to extrapolate results from a focus group or two into a nationwide sample, or a major decision on spending on marketing or product development. And as tempting as it is, it's really you have to be very careful, because you can't necessarily project the responses of, say, 10 focus group respondents onto what a nationwide sample might reveal, as good as your recruiting might be for your panels. And then quantitative, of course, where you're typically surveying some reasonable number of respondents, typically done online or by phone. And phone, pretty unusual these days, except, of course, if you're talking about political polling, or if you need to get respondents in a very particular geographic location, such as, again, political polling by state, or if you wanted to do a deep dive by metro area or a particular state, or if you really needed to reach a very specific sample of, let's say, just venture capitalists who deal in education technology, or just thoracic surgeons, or something where online panel providers just won't be able to provide sufficient sample. But keep in mind, taking a survey on the phone these days, of course, might mean actually taking the survey on your iPhone or your Galaxy or whatever. And that's an important consideration to keep in mind when we talk about the survey tool. And quant, of course, it's great for validation of the hypotheses that you might generate via qual if you've preceded it with qual, or might be hypotheses that you or your sales team or whatever has. And of course, great for segment sizing and just understanding what are the actual projectable metrics of the market that you're interested in. Quant is not so great for ideation. When you ask someone online, what would be the best way for you to do your banking that you can't do now? In our experience, you don't tend to get very good answers for that. That's best left for, an ideation session, or perhaps assessed via qual. But on a screen, those questions tend to fall flat, unless you're giving folks, some sort of response options to react to or choose from. The next thing that I wanted to touch on, and this is very much related to planning stage, but it's a little bit different in that if there is the opportunity to prepare for your research, if you have a big research initiative and you really want to understand, for example, should we be making a big spend on, TV or outdoor or online, or should we make a, huge investment in a partnership or a new product or a promotion? If you've got a big decision to make and you're going to justify that decision or optimize it via research, it can make sense to conduct pre-research, for example, to ensure that you have the right incidents, so that you want to really understand, for example, what's utilization or purchase intent in a particular product or solution, or, what is actual brand awareness, or very practically, do people understand the questions you're trying to ask, or the response options that you're providing? So that can be fantastically useful as a way to ensure that you're really getting the most from your research budget. And that's one of the ways that clients use, for example, our SMB Pulse as a quick and pretty inexpensive way to assess, for example, questions and response options. Another huge area where things can go awry in research is, of course, determining who exactly are you researching, or who are you surveying. And this, of course, is more relevant to quantitative than to qual. The qual screening tends to be pretty carefully done. As a general rule, it goes well. Can depend, but qual screening can go very well. But with quantitative screening, or determining exactly who you need to have participate in your survey, a lot of factors to consider. So, starting at the top, who exactly are we going to survey? Like, are they available via a survey, via the protocol you want? So as I mentioned, for example, if you just wanted to get VCs who specialize in some particular kind of investment area, or if you just want to get some particular kind of surgeon, or something where it's a very small sample, you may not be able to get them online. Or for example, if you just want to understand how are small businesses in Nevada feeling, or Massachusetts, or some state where there's not necessarily going to be a huge amount of sample, you may have to do phone work as opposed to relying on an online sample provider. And are you assuming a realistic incidence level for those folks? So it might be one thing to say we want to find small business owners, but another thing to say, we want to find small business owners who have a active line of credit and are actively using it. Your sample pool can get pretty small pretty quickly, and so you don't want to assume that there's too many of those folks available. And likewise, if you're in the technology arena, and you want to find a very particular role, like someone who's a server administrator, network administrator, whatever, those can be difficult to find. And you want to make sure that you've got the appropriate solution in place, which might even mean, what happens if you start to field and you realize, you can't get as many as you need. Do you have a plan for your worst case, which might mean expanding to a bigger pool of panel providers or relaxing your sampling criteria? But it's important, if you're really going after some specific sample, to be prepared for low incidence or potentially a worst case. And then in terms of again, who you're going to survey on the sampling, or do you have the right mix of respondents? So in many cases it might be perfectly fine to sample the general small business population. And in that case, you're going to get a natural distribution by size and a natural distribution by industry. But if you're hoping, for example, to get a significant number of, let's say, companies with 100 to 500 responses, and you're going to do natural distribution, you better have a pretty big sample, because companies with 100 to 500 employees only constitute about 0.2% of the SMB universe. So, you may need to set quotas if you want to get, again, specific industries, specific size groups, specific roles. And do you have the right number of respondents? General rule of thumb in research is, if you want to compare segments between each other, you should really have about 75 per cell. So you want to make sure that your cells are broadly enough defined that you can get 75 of them, and that you're setting quotas. And if you're not, are you, and I should say, if you are, for example, setting quotas, then if you're going to present total responses, are you weighting the sample so that it is actually representative? So, just as an example of what I mean by that, when we field the SMB pulse, fully half of the respondents are under 20 employees, another 150 of the 500 are 20 to 99, and another 100 are 100 to 500 employees. And we do that so that we can get a good read on each of those different size groups. But if we just presented the data back using that distribution, the larger businesses would be vastly overrepresented, and the data would be hugely skewed in all kinds of ways, because bigger businesses tend to be much more optimistic and much more likely to consume content, much more likely to purchase, pretty much anything you ask about. So you need to apply the weightings if you're going to look at total data to make sure that you've actually modeled a representative sample of your audience universe. And then screening error. It can be easy to set your qualifying questions incorrectly. So, for example, if you want to get someone who makes some marketing decisions for an organization, you might assume that the principal is a good person to do that. But if you only ask about their level within the organization, you might miss that, the organization, which might only have 20 people, does actually have a, director or head of marketing, and that's the person that you really want to go after. So a better screening question might be, are you the person that makes marketing decisions for your organization, as opposed to, are you the principal? And then on panel providers, all panel providers are not alike, and they vary quite a bit in terms of how they go about recruiting participants, how they incent participants, how they manage their respondents, I should say. As a result, that can vary quite a bit, and that matters because even though, best practice is, of course, to use a third-party panel provider, and they do, as a general rule, do a very good job of screening, their panelists and ensuring that they have, a representative mix of small business respondents. Still, from panel provider to panel provider, the mix can vary. So, you might get in one panel provider folks who skew younger, and they tend to use more, for example, they take surveys more on their phones. And younger respondents tend, as a general rule, to be, again, more optimistic, more likely to make a purchase, whereas some panel providers might just happen to have an older mix of respondents who are more likely to take surveys on a big screen, and tend, as a general rule, to be less optimistic and run smaller businesses. So, really important to understand how is your partner, your research partner, choosing the right panel provider to use for your particular survey. And then, that also ties into if you're doing any kind of a tracker. So if you have like an annual survey of something, and it might just be, brand awareness or incidents or satisfaction or whatever, using the same panel provider can make a significant difference in the responses or the results you get from year to year, period to period. Because again, not all panels are alike, because not all panel providers are alike, and the variation can be fairly significant. And then feeling error, as I mentioned, if you have a hard to reach sample, or if you have a particularly large sample, you're surveying internationally, have you allocated enough time for that? And if you're under a real deadline, for your results to come back, that can really be important. And then finally, respondent quality, or we'll spend quite a bit of that time on that because that's super important in terms of, not just setting all of the dials correctly in terms of choosing your panel provider and structuring the question, your screener questions correctly, but then actually actively monitoring respondents to ensure you are in fact getting good data. And that leads me to the next topic, the survey instrument. So your questionnaire, of course, if you're doing online, or your discussion guide for qualitative, whether it's phone work or online, or even live research, live focus groups. And of course, really important to ensure, are the questions clear, or you might inadvertently have a leading question that brings someone to an answer that you may or may not have meant to bring them to, but you want to really be sure your framing is neutral for respondents. And then question important, it's really easy to jam a lot of questions into a survey tool. We figure we're going to spend the money on research, let's ask as many questions as we can. But that can be a pretty risky strategy because there can be burnout on the part of respondents. And, in particular, there was a piece of research by one of the panel providers that found that respondents, for example, take on average about 75 seconds to answer the first question, but by the time they get to the 20 or 25th question, they're taking about 19 seconds. So you want to be sure you're asking your most important questions first, and you want to be sure that your survey isn't too long, because then you start to get dropouts, or you start to get speeders who are just zipping through the survey as quickly as they can, selecting random responses effectively just to get the incentive. The response options should be comprehensive, comprehensible, parallel, mutually exclusive, all that good stuff, but they also shouldn't be too many. Because the experience of taking a survey online, where you might have a table of a whole host of different kinds of response options, of product attributes or what have you, and there's some sort of rating to choose from, I like this very much to I don't like this at all for each of these different attributes. On a big screen, with a mouse, that's super easy to click through. On a phone, however, with a small screen, you have to rate rather each response individually and then scroll through the next screen, and it might take a while to reload. by the time they're done with 7 or 8 responses, they may check out. So really important to make sure that your survey is designed for every device and the questionnaire isn't too long. And so just a couple things. And by the way, if you want a copy of this deck, with any of these guidelines, more than happy to send it over. No need to take screenshots or anything like that. But really important, as I mentioned, when you're developing the questionnaire, think about how it's going to work on all. Is it going to be equally usable and easy to answer on the big screen as it is on a tablet or on a smartphone, which are of course increasingly being used, and especially by younger respondents. Respect the respondent. One of the things that's important about respecting the respondent is asking questions that they can answer. So, I personally had a survey from a bank, and they asked what our user experience was of 2 of their big competitors' bank sites. And of course, the answer is I have no idea. I don't have password on those. I'm, a customer of my bank, and I've never used the online banking services of other banks. So, really think about the kinds of questions that they can answer. And respect their intelligence, but respect their time, but also, don't overestimate their knowledge, in your category or their awareness of particular things. We're often surprised by, especially the smaller businesses, their awareness of brands or influencers. It's pretty low. They're really heads down and they're in their business. So you really need to be focused on, what's their worldview, what kind of things are realistic for them to know about that they can answer. Conversely, be sure that you are asking all of your important questions, because if you don't ask, obviously you can't answer it. Minor kind of technical point. Do you make all your questions so that they're mandatory? You have to take them. We just here at Bredin, we tend to make the qualifiers, of course, mandatory, and then after that, they're not. We see very little skipping of questions. When someone's in the survey, they tend to go all the way through. But just for the user experience, important, vary the question types, vary the question length. Ensuring tracking questions are evergreen. This is really important. So, if you were to say this year we're going to start a survey and it's going to be the, our company name annual survey of small business X, whatever the topic is, really important that those questions are going to be as useful in 5 or 10 years as they are today. Whatever it is that you're going to be using on an ongoing basis. So, focusing on COVID, for example, at this point, that might not play so well in a couple of years. Or focusing on a particular technology that might be outdated. So you just need to be careful about setting kind of permanent or tracker questions. And then QAing this coded survey, of course, really important, to ensure that your terminates work, the skip logic all works, and that there's no typos, and those do happen. So you really want to ensure a successful experience for the user, and that you're terminating all the folks that you don't want to have participate and not terminating the folks that you do. A note on question order, and I won't belabor all of these, but they're really important considerations for questionnaire design. Just in terms of organizing the questionnaire, going from macro to micro. So. And actually, before I get into that, just in terms of the screener, really important, kind of as a courtesy to your panelists, to make sure that if they don't qualify, they're screened out early. So what you don't want to do is, ask a question in the middle of your survey that is going to be mandatory, and if they don't answer in an appropriate way, they're terminated, because by then they will already have spent some time answering the previous question. So what you want to do, of course, is minimize the number of questions that your candidates for termination are going to be asked. So put your qualifying questions up front as much as possible. And then, once they're qualified and they're in, you want to make sure you start out with the big questions that you need answered, and then later on focus in on, the slightly less important or more tactical stuff as opposed to the strategic. And then you also want to be sure that if you're asking any kinds of, really personal questions, like, for example, what's your household income, what's your education level, what party are you affiliated with, anything like that that they might object to up front, you want to save those for the end, by the time they're kind of warmed up, engaged, and don't necessarily see those questions as intrusive as they might, if you ask them kind of, cold right at the start of the survey. And likewise, you want to avoid asking priming questions. And by that, I just mean, a question that might set expectations. And an example, in the consumer sphere might be, are you concerned about crime levels in America? And then the next question might be a list of concerns about life in America. If crime is one of those, then they're going to have been primed to select crime as, an overriding concern. So you just want to be careful about, are you potentially influencing the responses by the nature of your survey? And then, this is the second set of questions. This doesn't go on forever, but, really important when you're designing the questionnaire to keep your questions neutral. So, obviously you don't want to use any superlatives or insults or anything like that, but you really want to think about what's the best question type to get at the response. Is it a rating? Is it a ranking? Is it yes, no? Is it multiple choice? Are you going to ask any open ends? And we'll touch on that a little bit more. If you're going to be asking unaided questions, like, for example, name the top 5 banks that you can think of. You want to do that first before you put a list of 20 banks and say, please indicate these banks that you're familiar with. Again, stands to reason, but you just want to be careful to do that. And then social desirability basis, you just don't want to ask questions to which the respondent is going to feel like you would like them to answer in a particular way, or they want to answer in order to, feel good about themselves or present themselves in a particular way. Avoiding double negative, some of this is just simple, good English/grammar. But what we do see a lot is a real temptation to, again, assume a certain level of knowledge in any particular industry because we are all steeped in our particular industries. And it's really easy to assume that, other folks are as well. But again, if you're surveying SMBs, especially, again, at small businesses, their awareness level of different things may be quite different from yours. So you want to make sure you're not assuming, again, that they know everything about, virtualization or whatever the topic is at hand. So don't assume they're going to understand acronyms or technical terminology or industry specific jargon. And then finally, around the response options, how are you going to scale different questions? For example, is it going to be something that ranks from extremely positive to extremely negative, or are you just going to use a 1 to 5 scale or a 1 to 10 scale? Are you going to force them to take a stand? For example, are you going to have just, for example, very unsatisfied and very satisfied? Or are you going to have a neutral scale in the middle? Are you going to give them the option to effectively opt out of a question by saying, does not apply or don't know? And then one thing that's also important, just to avoid bias among respondents, is making sure that, in response lists, for example, if you're presenting attributes of a particular product and you're asking people to select, what they want, you want to randomize the order in which they're presented, and ideally you want to rotate rows, when you're presenting scales. Here's an example, by the way. This is from some research that we did not too long ago, of the last of the 5 issues that we'll talk through, which is fielding and analysis. And this is just, I mentioned that the panel providers, as a general rule, are really good about providing you, for example, if you ask them for a marketing director at companies with under 100 employees in the United States, that's generally what you get. However, as you can see at the bottom, 38% of survey respondents, and this is, by the way, across consumer and B2B. I don't know what the exact incidence is in B2B. It might be a little bit less. So, every panel provider has all different kinds of methodologies to ensure that, when someone signs up, they're vetted, and, when they take a survey, they actually are who they say they are. But, if you put an incentive out on the internet, people are going to be tempted to figure out a way to get it. So, there are individuals who will take surveys, and there are programmers who will develop bots, of course. And one of the ways to capture them is to ask open ends and then determine, and this is where research is a labor of love because it's pretty time intensive to go through all the open ends. and see, by individual respondent, who's answering, with pretty much the exact same copy. Sometimes it's copy that they're just going to cut and paste from one question to the next. Sometimes it's copy that they'll have searched and found online. It's completely random. And we've gone back and found the copy that they take, and it makes absolutely no sense how it's relevant to the survey, but, they figured they have to fill an open-end text box. And so, you can tell the ones that we've highlighted here are, obviously scammers, because they're providing pretty much the same answer to all of these different questions. Pretty easy to know that these should be deleted. They're not quality respondents. One thing to keep in mind, though, it's very tempting to eliminate open-end responses where the English is not great. But again, if you're surveying respondents from very small businesses, a fair number of them are first-generation immigrants to the United States, and English may or may not be their first language. So just keep in mind, poor English skills may not necessarily mean that you've got a fraudulent respondent. And it can be important, if you have a question like that based on their open ends, to take a look at the other responses that they're providing, because of course those can be really insightful responses. So anyway, in terms of overall feeling and analysis, things that can go wrong. IP address, we obviously do a check and see if they're from America. That's pretty easy to spoof, though, so it doesn't mean a lot if their IP address is from America. But time through survey. So, if you have a 30-question survey and some of the questions have a lot of response options and they completed it in a minute, there's an issue. So you want to set a minimum time and just cut it off. It might be 3 minutes or 5 minutes, but any faster than that, it's not likely that data is any good. And then, of course, as I mentioned, open-ended response. Do the responses make any sense? Did they provide effectively the same answer for every open end? And then, of course, in the analysis, hopefully up front, you determined, exactly what kind of analysis are we going to do? Is it cluster analysis, factor analysis, pricing, segmentation, or is it simple, looking at sig tests, and you want to make sure, you've got the right subsegment groupings. And that might actually depend on how your responses play out. So, for example, it may make sense to cluster industry subgroups different way, depending on, how many you got if you didn't set any quotas. You might want to determine what your significance cutoff, for example, are you only comfortable looking at the 95% confidence level, or are you comfortable with 90%? Depends a little bit on, the size of your subgroups. And then does it matter to look at different subgroups? So for example, if you really want to understand how to go to market against 5 priority industries, do you really care how they differ against each other, or do you just want to understand how each of them ticks individually? Or conversely, if you're looking at developing personas, might be interesting to determine, how your different personas vary from each other. But again, probably most important to understand how internally cohesive each of those personas are. And then not least, once you've got all your data, what's that actually mean? So it's really easy, of course, to generate the facts from your survey. So 50% of folks are interested in, getting a multifunction printer this year. That's great. But what does that actually mean? So, really important to have a research partner that can help you just take that data the extra step to say, what that means is that there's a huge market opportunity and it's particularly represented by this segment who is particularly susceptible to this kind of offer delivered by this kind of media. So really taking the extra step to go from just like, what does the data say, to what does that mean in terms of, product or marketing activity, really important. So the biggest mistake, and this is the bonus, but just not doing nothing. Obviously, we've covered tons and tons of things that can go wrong in the execution of research, but a lot of things can go right, and most important of which, you get a sense from your market of what the opportunity is for your product, or what the best way to reach them is, or what messaging they're most responsive to. So, it doesn't have to be completely perfect in order for you to get fantastic insights into your marketplace. And we are, I have to say, continually, kind of pleased and surprised at the results our clients get based on the insights they get from our research. So, for example, one client determined that direct mail, as old school as that might seem, was a really good way to reach a high propensity audience of theirs, and they started using it, and it's been a fantastically valuable tactic. And as a result, that's generated a huge ROI on the research effort that they undertook. So there can be huge payback on research, and it doesn't have to be perfect to be really useful. So with that, what I wanted to close on is a couple questions to ask your market research vendor. So one of the things that's really important, because we have pretty high variability from client to client in their own research expertise. Some come to us with very well crafted goals and the methodologies they want to use, the audience they want to target. Others have literally told us, you're the experts, you tell us what to ask. But what you really want is someone who does understand, for example, in financial services or in technology, what kind of questions are going to yield useful, actionable results. Or, if you're generating data for content, how do you structure a questionnaire in such a way as to get insights that are really going to be meaningful and differentiated for your readership? What's your experience in SMB, of course? What methodologies do you provide? So do you do qual, do you do quant? And then analytically, what sort of capabilities do you bring to bear? If we're doing a pricing exercise, that's quite different from, just doing a message testing, for example. So you want to be sure your partner can support the methodologies that are going to get you to the right answer. And that can vary quite a bit, again, depending on what your objectives are. How do you find panelists? We spent quite a bit of time on panel providers and the variance there. How do you make sure that even after the panelists have done the best that they can in screening providers, that you're also making sure that you're only getting, really plausible, credible results? And then what other support do you provide? So, for many of our clients, it's really important for them to have some sort of a context for their research. So, for example, if you're setting out on, understanding what is the interest, again, in loan or line of credit or, online banking services, it's really helpful if your partner has done a lot of work in that area, understands not just, kind of the questions to ask and what's going to be meaningful and, has an idea of incidents, for example, but also has some background research that they might be able to share on those kinds of questions. Or, can they do agile research? So, it doesn't always make sense to spend the time and budget to develop a full, research initiative. So that's actually why we created the pulses. So many of our clients said, we just need a few questions answered quickly, or, can you turn our data into content? And so in some cases, if you have a specific, content marketing initiative in mind that's going to support your marketing calendar, if your client can turn, or if your agency can turn that data into content, that can be a really useful service as well. One thing that I don't think I mentioned at the start is if there are any questions up front, you can answer them or you can ask them rather in the little sidebar on the side. I don't see any, but you know how to find me. I sent the reminder emails via go-to-market, so hopefully you have my email address. If you'd like a copy of this deck, please feel free to shoot me a note. Yeah, my email is also on the slide. And if you'd like a copy of the recording, we're happy to send that to you. If we can help you with SMB research, please let us know. Again, you might have gotten a sense from this. It's something that is near and dear to our hearts, and we love doing it. And as long as we've been at this, we're always surprised by something that we find in every research initiative. And that's part of what we like about SMBs is, they're constantly evolving and surprising you with their sophistication or their innovation. We also hope, if we can support you with content that you might reach out to us as well. But we'll be running another session in a couple of weeks in the middle of May with Rob Parsons from Paychex. He's going to be talking about the use of webcasts and podcasts in engaging SMBs. I hope you can join me for that. But in the meantime, I know it went a little bit long. I hope you have enjoyed this and gotten some food for thought based on this presentation. And I hope that we will see you on our next webcast on May 19th. Have a great afternoon.